Welcome to G Fun Facts Online. Today, we are going to talk about the physics of messiness. There is a famous phrase in science coined by the physicist Eugene Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. It refers to the spooky ability of clean, elegant equations to describe the natural universe. But for most of the 20th century, that effectiveness had a limit. It worked beautifully for perfect crystals, for isolated atoms, for the frictionless vacuum of space. It worked for the clean and the orderly. But the real world is not clean. The real world is dirty, chaotic, and frustrated. It is filled with systems that cannot find a single best arrangement, systems that get stuck, and systems that remember. In the last decade, a specific and seemingly messy branch of mathematics has begun to assert an even more startling effectiveness. It is the physics of disordered systems. This is the story of how a theory about broken magnets became the unified field theory of intelligence and life. It is a framework now broadly termed Glassy physics, and it reveals a universal dynamic connecting the freezing of water, the folding of proteins, the migration of cancer cells, and the learning capabilities of artificial intelligence. To understand this unified theory, we have to start with the problem that spawned it. We need to look at the physics of a fridge magnet, and then see how it breaks. In the standard model of ferromagnetism, atoms act like tiny compass needles, which physicists call spins. In a happy, simple state, all these spins align in the same direction. This minimizes the system's energy. It is a form of social conformism in the atomic world. Everyone agrees. Everyone points north, and the system settles into a single stable ground state. This is why a magnet works. But in the 1970s, experimentalists encountered materials that refused to conform. They mixed small amounts of magnetic iron into a non-magnetic lattice of gold or copper. The resulting alloy behaved very strangely. The iron atoms were scattered randomly. They were too far apart to form a standard magnet, but they were close enough to interact. Crucially, these interactions were random. Some pairs of atoms wanted to align, a ferromagnetic interaction, while others wanted to anti-align, pointing in opposite directions. This created a condition physicists call frustration. To understand frustration, imagine a love triangle. Alice wants to date Bob. Bob wants to date Charlie. But Charlie refuses to date anyone who dates Alice. There is no solution that satisfies everyone. If Alice and Bob get together, Charlie is unhappy. If Bob and Charlie get together, Alice is unhappy. In the material science version of this problem, a specific atomic spin might be told by neighbor A to point up, and by neighbor B to point down. It cannot satisfy both constraints. When you cool such a system down, it does not settle into a single perfect crystal structure. Instead, it freezes into a disordered, confused state. It gets stuck. But it does not just get stuck in one way. It can get stuck in billions of different ways, each representing a local energy minimum. It finds a solution that is good enough, but not the best. This material is called a spin glass. To visualize what is happening inside a spin glass, physicists developed one of the most powerful metaphors in modern science, the energy landscape. I want you to imagine a vast mountain range. In this metaphor, elevation represents energy. In physics, everything wants to go to the lowest energy state possible, so imagine a ball rolling down these mountains. If the system was a perfect crystal, the landscape would look like a smooth funnel. No matter where you drop the ball, it rolls straight down to the single deepest valley at the bottom. That is the global minimum. But a spin glass is different. A spin glass has a rugged, craggy landscape filled with millions of valleys, ridges, traps, and high mountain lakes. If you drop a ball here, it will quickly roll down and get stuck in a high mountain lake. It is a local minimum. It is trapped. It cannot climb back up over the ridge to find a deeper valley. This rugged landscape is the central object of the new universal physics. It explains why finding the optimal solution in complex systems is incredibly hard. In computer science terms, we call this nitrogen monophosphide hard. The mathematical breakthrough required to understand this landscape came from the Italian physicist Giorgio Parisi, who won the 2021 Nobel Prize for this work. Parisi solved the Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model, which is a mathematical idealization of a spin glass. What Parisi discovered was fascinating. He found that the stuck states of a spin glass were not just random, they were organized hierarchically. If you looked at the system at a high temperature, the energy landscape looked like a few large valleys. But if you looked closer, or lowered the temperature, those valleys fractured into smaller sub-valleys. And if you looked closer still, those sub-valleys fractured again into sub-sub-valleys. This fractal branching of states is known as replica symmetry breaking. It implies that complex systems have a memory structure inherent in their physics. The system is not just disordered. It possesses a rich, taxonomic complexity, like the branches of a phylogenetic tree connecting all species of life. This hierarchical organization of pure states is the mathematical fingerprint of complexity. Now, why does this matter to us? Because this same mathematics explains how we think. In 1982, Caltech biophysicist John Hopfield made the connection that would eventually ignite the AI revolution. He realized that the valleys in a spin-glass energy landscape could be treated as memories. Hopfield proposed a neural network where neurons were binary, either on or off, just like the atomic spins were up or down. The connections between the neurons, the synapses, functioned exactly like the magnetic interactions in the alloy. In this model, learning is the act of sculpting the landscape. To memorize a pattern like an image of the letter A, the network adjusts its synaptic weights so that the pattern A becomes a low-energy valley in the landscape. Recall then becomes a physical process. If you show the network a noisy, corrupted version of the letter A, it is like placing the ball on the side of that valley. The physics of the system naturally slides the state down into the bottom of the valley. The network remembers the original pattern simply by relaxing into its energy minimum. This was the hydrogen atom of computational neuroscience. It proved that memory is a physical attractor in a high-dimensional energy landscape. Fast forward to the modern era of deep learning. Today's massive neural networks, like the large language models we use daily, are essentially giant spin glasses. They have billions of parameters or weights that are adjusted to minimize a loss function, which is just another word for energy. For years, critics argued that deep learning should not work. They argued that the energy landscape of a billion-parameter network should be so rugged, so full of traps and bad local minima, that the optimization algorithm would get stuck immediately. It should be impossible to train these models. Yet, they train easily. Why? The answer lies in a phenomenon called the Gardner Transition. This is a concept borrowed from the physics of jamming, which studies how hard spheres like marbles pack into a box. In a normal spin glass, the valleys are narrow and V-shaped. To stay there, you have to be precise. But Elizabeth Gardner, a physicist in the 80s, showed that in certain marginally stable systems, the bottom of the valley is not a point, it is a flat plane. The valley floor fractures into a fractal network of marginally stable subbasins. Recent research suggests that over-parameterized neural networks operate in this Gardner phase. Because they have so many dimensions, billions of weights, there are always extra directions to move around obstacles. The bad minima turn into saddle points, meaning you can always go down in at least one direction. Crucially, the system finds flat minima. Imagine a wide, flat basin in the mountains. If the network settles here, a slight shift in the data, which we can think of as noise, does not change the error much. This corresponds to generalization. If the network found a sharp, narrow valley, it would fit the training data perfectly, but fail on new data. That is overfitting. But in a flat basin, the solution is robust. Thus, the unreasonable success of AI is due to the specific topology of high-dimensional glassy landscapes. The noise of the training process kicks the ball out of sharp valleys until it settles into a massive, flat basin, a Gardner state, where the solution works for everyone. While computer scientists were building silicon spin glasses, biologists were discovering that life itself is a navigator of rugged landscapes. The Glassy physics framework has now invaded three distinct areas of biology: protein folding, gene networks, and tissue mechanics. Let's look at proteins first. Proteins are long chains of amino acids that must fold into a specific 3D shape to function. This is an optimization problem. The protein needs to find the lowest energy shape. If a protein were a standard spin glass, a random polymer, the landscape would be too rugged. The protein would get stuck in a misfolded local minimum and never find its native state. It would take longer than the age of the universe to fold, a problem known as Levinthal's paradox. Nature solved this by evolution. Evolution has smoothed the landscape. Natural proteins are minimally frustrated. Their landscape looks like a funnel. It is rugged at the top, but the overall slope guides the protein inevitably toward the native state. However, the glassiness is still there. When proteins misfold, as in Alzheimer's or prion diseases, they're essentially falling into a glassy trap. They find a deep, non-native valley that they cannot escape from. These aggregates, known as amyloid plaques, are the biological equivalent of a frozen spin glass. The second biological arena is the gene regulatory network. In 1957, Conrad Waddington famously depicted cellular development as a ball rolling down a landscape of branching valleys. A stem cell starts at the top and can roll into the liver cell valley or the neuron valley. For decades, this was just a metaphor. Today, we know it is a literal mathematical description. The genes in a cell interact like spins. Gene A turns on gene B, or turns off gene C. Stuart Kauffman formalized this with the NK model, a spin glass model for evolution. In this model, N is the number of genes, and K is the number of connections per gene, representing the level of frustration. Kauffman showed that life exists on the edge of chaos. If K is too low, the system is too ordered, the landscape is too smooth, and evolution stops because the system is frozen. If K is too high, the system is chaotic. The landscape is too rugged. A single mutation throws the organism into a completely different, likely fatal state. Biology tunes its networks to the critical point, where K is approximately 2. Here, the landscape is rugged enough to allow for complex different cell types, but smooth enough that the system is stable. Modern single-cell sequencing has allowed us to map Waddington's landscape. We can now see the attractors, which are the cell types, and the saddles, which are the transition states. Cancer, in this view, is a regression. It is a cell tunneling back over a ridge into an atavistic proliferative valley that should have been inaccessible. The third and perhaps most direct application of Glassy physics is in the mechanics of tissues themselves. How does an embryo form? How does a tumor metastasize? Cells in a tissue are like coffee beans packed in a bag. In a developing embryo, the tissue is in a fluid state. Cells flow past each other to shape organs. In a mature tissue, the system enters a solid or jammed state. Cells are locked in place by their neighbors. This is a jamming transition. It is governed by density, motility, and crucially, cell shape. Lisa Manning and researchers at Syracuse University discovered that there is a shape index, defined as the ratio of a cell's perimeter to its area. They found an unjamming transition. If cells become slightly more elongated and squishy, the tissue undergoes a phase transition from a solid glass to a liquid fluid. This explains metastasis. A solid tumor is jammed. To spread, cancer cells undergo a biological process called the epithelial to mesenchymal transition. Physically, this is a glass-to-liquid transition. The cancer cells melt their way out of the tumor, flow through the body, and then potentially rejam or freeze to form a new tumor elsewhere. Oncologists are now looking at jamming as a therapeutic target. If we can force the tumor back into a glassy, solid phase, the cells cannot spread. The unification here is striking. We are looking at the same mathematics appearing in distinct realities. In spin glasses, atoms frustrated by random magnetism freeze into complex, hierarchical states. In neural networks, weights frustrated by conflicting data constraints settle into flat basins of memory. In proteins, amino acids frustrated by steric clashes funnel into folded states. In tissues, cells frustrated by crowding undergo jamming transitions to become solid or fluid. The profound insight is that complex adaptive systems, whether they are learning algorithms or living organisms, tend to evolve toward a state of marginal stability. They do not want to be perfect crystals, because crystals are too rigid and cannot adapt. They do not want to be liquids, because liquids are too chaotic and cannot retain information. They want to be glasses. A glass is a solid that flows on long timescales. It has structure, but it is not rigid. It yields to stress without shattering. It has a memory of how it was formed. The Gardner phase is the mathematical description of this Goldilocks zone. It is a state where the landscape is fractal, full of neutral pathways that allow for evolution and learning. In AI, this marginal stability allows the network to learn new things without forgetting the old, avoiding catastrophic forgetting. In biology, it allows the organism to be robust against mutations while still being able to evolve. We used to think of disorder as the absence of order. We thought of it as entropy, as noise, as something to be eliminated. The physics of spin glasses has taught us that disorder is a resource. Complexity requires frustration. Without conflicting constraints, there is no landscape, no valleys to store memories, no varying cell types, and no adaptation. The universe, it seems, prefers the glassy state. It is the state of matter that allows for the emergence of information. AI is the engineering of artificial glassy landscapes to capture the structure of human knowledge. Biology is the navigation of evolutionary glassy landscapes to sustain life. Giorgio Parisi, in his Nobel acceptance speech, spoke of the flight of starlings. He described thousands of birds moving as a single critical entity, balanced on the edge of order and chaos. That flock is a living spin glass. The neurons in your brain watching the flock are a spin glass. The silicon chips training the AI to recognize the birds are a spin glass. We have found the universal dynamic. It is not a clockwork mechanism. It is a rugged, fractured, frustrated, beautiful landscape. And we are all rolling through it. Thank you for listening to G Fun Facts Online.